Self-Insight, Roadblocks and Detours on the Path to Knowing Thyself by David Dunning. To achieve a sense of self-awareness, we need to correct certain misconceptions and adopt specific thinking methods in our daily work and life. Many of us are familiar with situations like this. 1. In various entertainment talent shows, there are contestants with limited talent but high self-confidence during the audition phase. 2. On the internet, many people comment on hot topics in various fields based on their so-called common sense, often not believing in the explanations of authoritative experts and taking a moral high ground to judge others. 3. In our lives and work, we sometimes encounter situations where our performance falls short of our expectations, such as when exam scores or performance evaluations are lower than anticipated. How can we explain these confusing situations? This is where the author of this book, David Dunning, comes in. In 2021, Stanford University published an interesting list of the most cited theories and concepts proposed by authoritative experts in various research fields. David Dunning's name prominently appeared on the list in the field of psychology. He is a social psychology professor at the University of Michigan, focusing on human cognition and decision-making mechanisms. In 1999, he and his student Kruger co-authored a paper introducing a highly disruptive judgment about human self-awareness. They found that participants who performed poorly in a task were likelier to overestimate their performance. When it spread on the internet, this phenomenon became known as the Dunning-Kruger effect and was simplified into the famous phrase, "Clearly so ordinary, yet so confident." From this phenomenon, we can infer that achieving accurate and precise self-insight is deceptively simple yet challenging. Correctly understanding oneself is the foundation for making sound decisions in our work and life and for achieving our goals and self-improvement. Throughout human civilization, various philosophers have recognized the importance of accurate self-assessment. For example, in the ancient temple of Apollo at Delphi in Greece, there are inscriptions of two ancient sayings, "Nothing in excess" and "Know thyself." This consensus on the importance of self-assessment has transcended different civilizations. For a psychologist like Dunning, observing this phenomenon wasn't enough. It motivated him to research further the cognitive biases behind overestimating one's abilities. He wanted to understand how this overestimation of one's abilities occurred and the cognitive and social factors behind it. He also sought practical methods and assessment systems to help individuals correct their self-biases and make accurate self-assessments and predictions. In his book, David Dunning provides us with some data, such as in a questionnaire test for high school graduates. In this test, 60% of students believed their athletic abilities were above average among their peers. 70% of students felt that their leadership abilities were also above average. You might argue that teenagers at the age of 17 or 18 are naturally overconfident, but it's a phase they will outgrow as they enter adulthood and gain life experience. However, Dunning presents statistics that challenge this assumption. He conducted questionnaire tests with university professors and entrepreneurs preparing to start their own businesses. The results were surprising. 94% of university professors believed that their professional expertise in their research field was above average. 33% of entrepreneurs were confident in their ability to succeed and grow their businesses. It indicates that overestimating one's abilities is widespread and not limited to teenagers. So, how does this self-cognitive bias develop? As mentioned earlier, Dunning points out that one of the reasons people need to be made aware of their own skill and knowledge deficits is their poor self-assessment abilities. Accurate self-assessment requires insight and understanding of the knowledge and skills involved. In fields related to cognitive and intellectual abilities, this rule is particularly accurate. For instance, an excellent business manager will be well informed about the capabilities of their team members. Conversely, individuals with lower expertise in a particular area are more likely to overestimate their abilities. An example is amateur researchers who consistently submit materials to various research institutions, claiming to have solved significant research problems or overturned fundamental theories despite needing more professional competence and knowledge. To illustrate this, Dunning experimented. He had a group of university students take a logical reasoning test, divided them into 4 groups based on their test scores, and specifically selected the group with the poorest performance, the lowest 13%, to assess their self-evaluation. The results showed that despite performing poorly, these students believed they should be ranked in the top 60% and overestimated the number of questions they answered correctly. So, why do we often fail to perceive our own mistakes? Dunning offers 2 hypotheses. 1. The inability to perceive one's errors is not due to ignorance, but rather the presence of knowledge and a flawed application of that knowledge. 2. There are underlying logical flaws in human thinking that hinder us from accepting external feedback and learning from correct experiences. Although we have access to a wealth of information and knowledge on the internet, our overall error rate has remained relatively high. The issue lies in the flawed structure of our learning and its application. In the book, Dunning identifies several common flaws and limitations in our knowledge structures and the associated psychological experiments that provide evidence for these limitations. Here are 4 of the significant flaws and limitations. 1. Local rationality with global irrationality. Our knowledge may seem reasonable on a regional scale and have logical consistency, but it can be flawed and biased when considered globally. 2. Dunning-Kruger effect. This is the tendency for individuals with low ability in a specific domain to overestimate their ability in that domain. The less competent you are in an area, the more likely you are to overestimate your competence. 3. Flawed models of the world. People often create wrong models of the world based on their limited experiences and knowledge, leading to incorrect conclusions. These models can be too simplistic, failing to account for the complexity of reality. For ignorance of ignorance, people often don't know what they don't know, making it difficult to recognize the gaps in their knowledge. This leads to overconfidence in their understanding of various subjects. The first flaw is that the knowledge or information we possess may be reasonable and logical in parts, but overall, it is flawed and biased. In simple terms, it's the so-called can't see the forest for the trees phenomenon. For example, there is a widely circulated piece of food safety knowledge on the internet that claims eating persimmons and crabs together will lead to death because the vitamin C in persimmons will react with the arsenic in crabs, forming arsenic trioxide, which is the highly toxic substance known as arsenic. The chemical equation is even provided, making it seem very scientific and logical. However, if we investigate it closely, we find that this claim doesn't hold up. First, the oxidation-reduction reaction required for these needs very stringent conditions that can only be met in a professional laboratory, not in the human digestive system. Secondly, there's a famous saying in science, discussing toxicity without considering dosage is nonsense. Each kilogram of crab contains only about 0.5 milligrams of arsenic. Even if all conditions were met and the chemical reaction could occur in our bodies, a person would need to eat at least 100 kilograms of crabs at once to potentially experience poisoning. These cognitive biases and limitations in our knowledge structures can lead to overestimating our abilities and an inability to accurately self-assess. One of the most classic examples is the story of Abraham Wald, a Hungarian Jewish mathematician during World War II. After escaping the Nazis in Europe, Wald arrived in the United States and joined an organization called the SRG, Statistical Research Group, which worked with the U.S. government and Columbia University to provide statistical analysis for the military and war production efforts during World War II. One day, the U.S. military approached SRG, expressing concerns about the heavy losses suffered by Allied bombers in Europe. They wanted to improve military aircraft design by adding armor to increase their survivability. However, adding armor everywhere on the planes was not feasible, as it would affect their flight performance and payload capacity. The SRG analyzed the data on returning bombers to determine where armor should be added. The data revealed that, when ranked by the intensity of damage from low to high, the different areas on the aircraft were as follows: engines, fuselage, and other parts such as wings or tail sections. SRG's other experts suggested that armor should be added to the fuselage, as it carried the most damage and was the most critical part to protect. However, Wald disagreed with this conventional wisdom. He argued that his colleagues' logical analysis seemed valid on the surface, but was fundamentally flawed. Wald believed that, statistically, the probability of each part of the aircraft being hit by enemy fire in intense aerial combat was roughly equal. More importantly, he pointed out that SRG's experts had only analyzed the bombers that had survived and returned. The bombers that had been shot down were not included in their analysis. From a statistical perspective, the bombers that took more hits in the engines and fuel tanks and still returned comprised the majority of the data. Therefore, these areas were less likely to be hit and were not as critical as they seemed. In contrast, the relatively unscathed engines were crucial, as they were on the bombers that never made it back. So, Wald argued that armor should be added to the engines and fuel tanks instead. Despite facing opposition, Wald's argument eventually won the day. The military accepted his advice, reinforcing the bombers' engines and fuel tanks. This decision significantly increased their chances of surviving enemy attacks. Wald's theory became known as the survivorship bias. It is now a well-known concept in statistics. The third flaw in our thinking involves the massive amount of knowledge and information stored in our minds, sometimes lacking essential commonalities. These pieces of data cannot logically be linked or may not have a cause and effect relationship. People often overlook this and forcibly connect them, leading to errors like the fallacy of false attribution and improper analogies. The fallacy of false attribution includes such examples as the pirate fallacy, which falsely associates the decrease in global piracy over centuries with global warming, suggesting that pirates can reduce global temperatures. Improper analogies can be illustrated with a humorous internet joke about a student who, when caught cheating by looking at a textbook during an exam, argues that lawyers can look at case files during trials and architects can refer to blueprints when building, so why can't they look at their books during exams? The fourth flaw is the misleading vividness or availability heuristic. This occurs when people encounter information about a particular category repeatedly, even if that information is absurd or improbable. Over time, people perceive this information as more valid or reasonable, even when it's not. In summary, these cognitive biases and limitations in our thinking can lead to overconfidence and an inability to learn from losses and setbacks. People often remember their successes, but attribute failures to external factors, such as luck or circumstances. This can lead to a distorted perception of reality, and it takes a conscious effort to adjust one's self-assessment to a more objective level. Next, due to the human instinct to seek gain and avoid harm, we tend to believe information that aligns with our interests or fixed positions and reject or forget information that goes against them. The author, Dang Ning, provides an example. If a person is a left-handed blonde and comes across a report on a media platform stating that left-handed blondes live longer, they are likely to believe this assertion without delving into the scientific basis behind it and may dismiss any opposing views. To illustrate this point, Dang Ning mentions a psychological experiment. A group of volunteers was taken to a medical laboratory and asked to undergo a swab test. They were told that if the swab sample changed color, it meant they had a rare disease that would cause severe pancreatic problems later in life. Although psychologists entirely fabricated this rare disease, the volunteers immediately became anxious. Those who saw their swab sample change color refused to accept the results and even demanded a retest. At this point, the psychologists added that if their blood sugar was slightly higher or lower that day, the test result might not be accurate. Consequently, those who saw their swab sample change color suggested they should have their blood sugar tested immediately. In contrast, those whose sample did not change color remained unperturbed and trusted their test results. Moreover, humans tend to overestimate their abilities and the value of their possessions and resources. This overestimation leads people to think that they are unique individuals in society and that what they possess is also excellent. This belief is rooted in the human psyche as a defense mechanism against the anxiety of death. People often believe they are one of a kind, which helps them ward off the fear of dying, believing that their uniqueness will protect them from death and other disasters. However, this defense mechanism may hinder people from making accurate self-assessments. Dang Ning suggests that individuals must be aware of the potential pitfalls and consider implementing a self-awareness training program. He recommends the following. 1. Strengthening knowledge structure. Individuals should consciously reinforce their knowledge structure and engage in cognitive training to avoid making the same errors in action and decision making. 2. Enhancing environmental awareness. People should gather as many external environmental details as possible and objectively evaluate their impact. Often, people must fully understand the external environment or their conditions, which may lead to overconfidence. 3. Overcoming endowment effect. To mitigate this psychological bias, people should make more rational arrangements in their daily lives, career planning, and financial investments. Recognizing the endowment effect, where people overvalue what they already possess, can help them make better decisions. Dangning emphasizes that by following these principles, people can gradually improve their self-awareness and decision-making abilities and learn to evaluate themselves and their situations. It is vital for more accurate self-assessment and enhanced decision-making.